Hello, good morning and welcome to the latest episode of Developing the Trust, a podcast series dedicated to issues relating to the good estate management for schools. The subject of today's podcast is the route to decarbonising the 22,000 school estate. As a result of successive government underinvestment in our 22,000 school estate, it is now estimated that it will cost some £15 billion to return school buildings to a fit-for-purpose condition. And recent costed studies suggest a further $15 billion to decarbonise it. The two challenges are inextricably linked, and with finite government resources, there's surely going to be a need for market support. With me today to discuss these challenges is James Smurthwaite, MD of Green Net Zero. Good morning, James, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Tim. Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. I'm very much looking forward to this. Me too. I want to talk to you today about the multiple challenges and explore possible ways of overcoming them. I'd like to start with external challenges. Long lead in, obviously. So, D&O, they seem to be very inconsistent. With the UK sort of electrical infrastructure leading to difficulty of providing cost certainty for schools. That's just as a starter for 10.
Yep.
Planning permission. Again, inconsistent or poorly communicated guidance for approval for installations such as solar PV, air source heat pumps, etc. And therefore a risk remains over an application whether it be approved or not. So that's just two obstacles that schools or other clients need to overcome. Any thoughts?
Well, there are obviously barriers to a lot of different parts of decarbonising in the whole of the built environment in the UK, but specifically with schools, they're kind of stuck with what they've got. It's an old estate. We've seen electrical infrastructure within schools not really being fit for purpose in schools as they are without the kind of upgrade we're going to start to have to see when it comes to electrifying heat. The D&O side of it you speak about, obviously trying to get costs for upgrading these types of infrastructures is quite difficult without actually physically going to site and doing a survey with your local D&O and getting firm costs. And obviously the costs, an idea of the design and the impact that electrifying heat will have on the electrical infrastructure is quite tricky for schools to kind of forward plan and understand what that's going to look like. So when you're applying for things like funding, which I know that you do, it's quite complex because you can't predict what that's going to look like and what the impact's going to be on the school. Taking things from single phase to 3-phase, that's another big challenge we've got. Is that available locally? How much is that going to cost to bring it in from the local distribution area? And when you speak about planning as well, obviously air source heat pumps at the moment are probably one of the main routes that schools are taking to decarbonise their heat in particular. And planning applications on those have been loosened somewhat, but anything but above 45 kilowatts still needs to go through planning application. And the kind of biggest barriers to that really are noise admittance coming from the plant and visual kind of aspects of it as well. So there are potential barriers that people need to jump through, but there are ways around it. But it's quite difficult for schools to understand what they are without external advice and costs for surveys.
Yeah, so I think we've agreed that before we've even basically undertaken a full survey of the school and its existing infrastructure, there's these challenges anyway.
Yep.
And in theory could put a considerable cost to basically decarbonising the estate, to getting that electrical supply in there. One has to hope that there will be a drive from government to almost say yes, unless there's a very good reason to say no in terms of planning. However, it seems to me that there's just lack of coordination in terms of where in the country a school is and the existing investment in that infrastructure for D&O. I mean, are you aware of any sea change shortly or anything, or are we just going to be pot luck?
I think we're just pot luck. Unfortunately, there's obviously different demands on the grid at the moment that are coming from different areas. The electrification of vehicles is a big drive at the moment, trying to get charge points in there. Domestic upgrades at the moment is obviously taking quite a lot of toll on the upgrade of the grid. So it is very much just, as you said, pot luck really on what your local authority's doing, what you've got available, how close it is. Have you had provision for infrastructure in place already when your school was built, or is it so old it's never really been thought about? I mean, let's be honest, when these schools were built, gas was the future in a lot of instances, or prior to that, obviously coal and things like this would have heated buildings, but they never really thought that it was going to go to the point where it's going now, where everything's going to be electrified, and that demand on infrastructure is going to obviously increase. So
I just wonder how considerable a block that issue is in terms of the costs to being out of projects going live.
Well, the cost one thing, but obviously the availability of power has such a big knock-on effect to how much of your heat you can decarbonise within a building. So you've got a gas boiler in there at the moment, say it's 100 kilowatts. For you to be able to put a heat pump in there, you're probably going to need to put sort of 35 kilowatts extra of electrical capacity in to meet the same heat load, if that's what you find out you need in the building. So that's big challenge for schools to try and understand what that might look like, and also the cost behind it. But the grid availability has an impact on how much heat you can provide into the school. So they could potentially be left with a position where they can't actually fully decarbonise because they haven't got enough power to actually put that in there.
Okay, so there's clearly an external blocker, and then we get to, as you said, conducting a condition survey, and then we discover the existing age, condition and capacity of the existing distribution boards to be able to support an increase in electrical supply. Any such upgrades also have cost implications, don't they?
Correct. Yeah. You can't generally put in sort of things like heat pumps if you don't improve your electrical infrastructure. Some of these distribution boards and the main incoming power into the building and the plant rooms that this equipment is going to go into just isn't really fit for purpose. So again, you've got hidden costs in there of how much it's going to cost to upgrade the cabling and the electrics into those areas. New boards that need to go in. It soon starts to mount up. It's not as simple as just a heat pump. There's obviously a lot more that goes into it.
Exactly. Then we talk about, or we look at the building envelope itself, the existing levels of insulation or the U values for roofs, windows, cladding, doors, etc. How much of a potential loss would be to install a air source heat pump in a building which has not had a fabric first approach, where effectively that heat is basically just dissipating through roofs and walls. How big an impact on the performance and therefore the cost of carbon savings potentially derived from, for example, the installation of an air source heat pump is lost if the school building is anything but super insulated and not draft proof?
So obviously it's like heating a sieve effectively. If you're putting heat into a sieve, it's going to go out, it's going to leak everywhere. So what you then need to do to make sure that building is kept at a comfortable temperature is you have to increase that heat, which obviously uses more power, which decreases efficiency. So fabric is very, very important. The way we kind of look at it really, I think, is if your fabric's not fit for purpose, then you can still proceed with the decarbonisation of heat, but you might not realise the potential of that system until you started to make these changes. So if you've got if you've got a boiler that's not fit for purpose anymore, and you're looking at options of what you can do with it, don't potentially be put off by the fact your fabric's not up the right level, because over the next few years you can make planned upgrades to your fabric and realise the potential of it, but rather than wasting the opportunity to replace their system with something that's more efficient and more sustainable now, and kind of taking the easier option of putting what was already in there, we would kind of encourage people to just maybe, not put up with it so much, but kind of forward think a little bit on what you're going to have in the next 20, 25 years.
So on balance, if you didn't have a super insulated building, it would still make financial sense, as well as carbon sense, but financial sense, to install an air source heat pump and retrospectively pick up the roofs, the windows, the cladding as part of your planned maintenance program anyway.
I think that's a sensible way of doing it. The other thing that we're exploring a lot at the moment is, rather than a full replacement, is a hybrid replacement. So what we mean by hybrid is it's a gas boiler system coupled with an electric heating system. So the way that works is that the heat pump, which is generally what we're going to be using in most of our buildings going forwards, will still operate up to an efficient level. So it will take water temperatures up to 40, 45 degrees C. And then the gas boiler then boosts it to a higher temperature, which means comfort levels are still maintained in the building, but you don't quite realise those savings, those carbon savings and those energy savings you might otherwise see if you've already made all those really good upgrades to your building fabric.
I think for CFOs, for any trust, for any of my clients, we always get to the bottom line. I know that when one goes and sits into a meeting, we can appeal to cost and carbon, to the heart and to the mind, but effectively trusts are businesses and they have to operate on the bottom line. And I know there are a number of war stories doing the rounds across the sector that, due to a number of different reasons, the projected cost and carbon savings to be achieved have not been realised. These make a CFO and our sector that much more cautious. Can you shed any light on whether these shortfalls are as a result of miscalculations, poor workmanship, insufficient in-house capacity to run a complicated new system? What are the reasons behind the fact that, as a sector, we've not really had the return that we would have liked, or we were led to believe we'd have?
So I think it's a combination of a few different things. Obviously, there's been some funding coming into the sector through SALIX, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. And that scheme, up until the last round, was seen to be kind of a hybrid type approach to it was acceptable. So you could still put in a gas boiler and also a heat pump, which is decarbonising, which would typically get you your cost savings. Wouldn't quite realise the carbon savings that you maybe want to see. But the latest round that's just come through is all about full replacement. So it's all about replacing the infrastructure in the buildings to be suitable for heat pumps, and then taking out your fossil fuel heating system and replacing it with something more sustainable, renewable, which is typically a heat pump. Now, the problem we got at the moment is the spark gap, which is the cost difference between gas and electricity. We're kind of looking at 3 times difference between it. So average gas prices at the moment are around about 8.5p per kilowatt hour. Electricity is 26p per kilowatt hour if you're lucky. Some of them are a lot higher. So you're looking at a minimum of 3 times difference, which means that you're going to have to make sure your new equipment is 3 times more efficient as a minimum to even get a kind of level playing field on your costs to actually operate the system. That doesn't include any of your upfront costs to make upgrades and things like that. So that's the first port of call, is maybe that, the design doesn't quite realise the current fuel prices that the school is paying, what the future fuel prices might be that they're looking at. The other thing as well is the systems operate in a completely different way. We're used to it at home with your gas boiler that you've got. It's cold in the house, you go over to your thermostat and you knock it on, and within 20 minutes, half an hour, your house is pretty much at the temperature you want it to be. With electrified heat, with heat pumps, because they tend to operate at lower temperatures, you generally need to leave it running for a lot longer period of time at a lower temperature to let your building fabric actually operate as a bit of a heat sink to heat up and maintain that comfort level within the building. If the education levels aren't there within the estates team on a lot of these school sites, and they don't understand this, then there's a propensity to actually operate in the old way, which actually decreases efficiencies, which could leave you with a heating system that's costing you 2 to 3 times more than you were paying previously. Even though you're saving carbon, you are paying a lot more money for it. So it's just that education out there, making sure that systems are operating in the way that they're designed to be operating in, making sure they're being installed in the right way, and making sure that there's forward planning when it comes to energy costs as well that goes into it. But we've heard the war stories. And we know there's a problem out there at the moment in the way that these things are being designed, and I think there's a way around it, but it's just needs to be a bit more thought out and be a bit more particular to those individual schools rather than a kind of a statewide approach to it.
Yeah, one size does not fit all in our school estate.
Certainly
that's for sure.
Not, no.
I mean, the obvious question is, why is it so difficult to provide accurate return on investment illustrations? And why should the risk of these savings not being realised sit with the end user, school, DFE, and not the consultant or the funder whose business case the contract is modelled on?
It's a tricky one. So with a lot of other decarbonisation interventions, so things like lighting is a really good example. We use this an awful lot. You're comparing one fuel source and one need for the same fuel source and the same need. So you're just flipping out the technology that's in there for something that's a lot more efficient. So it's very easy to forward predict what that's going to look like. If you use X number of kilowatt hours the year before, you're going to reduce it by that amount. So it's quite straightforward. When it comes to the heating aspect, which is obviously the biggest side, the thing we're talking about today, it becomes more of a challenge because you're looking at 2 different fuel sources, as we just mentioned a minute ago, but also the systems operate in a different way. So to forward predict is very difficult. And obviously some of these school estate infrastructures, they've got within their buildings pipeworks hidden. We don't quite know the routes they're going down, and we don't know the controls. unless they've fully replaced everything, you're reliant on an old setup, an old system setup, to realise what the kind of forward planning is on the efficiencies on the heat pump system that's in there. So it's quite difficult to forward predict. Without simulation of your system and optimization, you're never really going to kind of understand what that looks like. And in terms of where the responsibility lies, well, really, if you're asking people to design a system for you and give kind of the evidence of what it's going to perform at, really it should sit with consultants and the people who are providing the funding and signing off. It should really sit with them. I don't see why a school should be sat with something that's not working in the way it's been promised to work, and kind of left with the bill. Really, at the end of the day, it's just not going to be helpful, is it?
No, but it is, as you just said, the design route and the costing route is fraught with all of these potentially unknown variables in terms of the condition, the system that you can tap into, etc. And it is one way out of that, although it's a front end cost, is to undertake an optimisation survey.
Yeah, definitely. So it's something we've been promoting as a business. There is upfront cost involved, but that upfront cost tends to help you realise the potential that's there. Otherwise, you're left with something, you're going down a blind alley, effectively. You're hoping that it's going to work in the way that it's supposed to work. But an optimisation, a digital twin of the whole building, allows you to fully understand your pipe work, where it runs, what the limitations are of that pipe work, what sort of temperatures you can expect to see. And you can almost upfront predict and operate that system to see how it's going to perform over a period of time, and what that impact will be on your operating costs and your carbon savings.
So if the accuracy of that survey is such that it would give consultants and funders the confidence upon which to model, then perhaps they ought to be underwriting the proposals to the schools, because
Certainly.
they are the ones in a position of strength. The schools are effectively led by consultants like us, and we have to make sure that the advice we're given and that we impart to them is accurate.
Yeah, exactly right. And that optimization is not just, and the digital twin that's provided as part of it isn't just the upfront design, it's also the sensor check at the end of it to make sure that it's been set up in the right way and it's been operated in the right way, and it allows you to go back and check that. So, that's so important to schools to have that kind of resource. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, for schools, it is the cost saving and not so much the carbon saving that's the driver. And, while schools deeply wish to play their part in decarbonisation and net zero, they cannot afford to be the agency that funds it. That is the bottom line. And I know that thus far we've talked about all of the challenges, but at some stage there's got to be a bottom line. There's got to be a return on investment, regardless of who's funding it, whether it's coming from government or from the market. And I guess what we're trying to explore now is what that's premised on. How accurate is that, and what level of detailed survey data do we need that we can all sit around the table, look each other in the eye, and say that's what we predict? It does seem to be an imprecise science, though.
It is. Yeah, it really is. I think the issue we've got at the moment is that we're all trying to decarbonise, and achieve net zero. That's the big thing that we're all trying to work on together. But you're the same as me. I wouldn't invest in something in my own house that provides a carbon saving but actually costs me a lot more money to run, unless I was in a luxurious position of being able to do that. So it's trying to find that balance between the two. And that goes back to that comment I made a bit earlier on about a hybrid system, where maybe you're not fully decarbonising your heating system, but you are realising a 60-65% reduction in carbon emissions. But what you are providing is you're providing a school with a cost reduction, and you're kind of taking that first step on your route of understanding how these new technologies work and what they look like, and kind of a bit of a touchy-feely kind of thing to it, to see that bit of plant outdoors or in your plant room that's working in a slightly different way. But it's giving the end user kind of a lot of tick boxes. They're doing something good, but they're also saving on their bottom line as well at the end of the day, and also probably saving in terms of the funds that are available. It's reducing the costs of that investment as well up front, which means there's more to go around. So it's probably the right route to go down. But in terms of the carbon thing you're talking about, because there's no carbon tax at the moment on fossil fuels, which there can't really be, because it's going to put a lot of people in fuel poverty if they go down that route. We're kind of stuck with just the right thing to do, being a driver, but ultimately the driver needs to be reduction in costs, operating costs.
Exactly. There doesn't seem to be an appropriate level of value attached to carbon, does there, at the moment?
No. Apart from the social pressure that's
there.
And
that's how measurable is that?
Exactly.
really
exactly.
difficult.
It is.
I mean, the funding gap is effectively where I think we've come to now in terms of coming full circle, and the huge chasm in investment that's required to the school estate. You know, the £15 billion black hole to bring our schools back to being safe, warm and dry and fit for purpose. You know, when you add another £15 billion to decarbonise it, you know, the numbers start to become pretty eye-watering, don't they?
Yep.
And so, you know, why has thus far the school estate, which basically accounts for over 50% of the government's portfolio, okay, and yet we only get effectively about 15% of the central funding.
Yep.
And from PSDS, we're 4 rounds of it now, is it something like that?
Yeah, we've gone 4 rounds. Yeah.
Thus
Coming to
far,
fifth.
the school estate, bearing in mind, as I said, it represents 50% of the square meterage. I think we've had between 7 and 10% of the funding come into the school estate. Why are we missing out?
Well, I think the thing you got to realise is, in terms of number of buildings and people responsible for those buildings, the school estate represents a massive amount. You've already said 50%. You know, it's a huge amount. You've got to think of those little silos of those school leaders and finance directors and people that are sat within there that need to kind of make the decision to apply for these funds. And if they've not made any of that work up front in the first place, then it's quite a long process to understand what you need to do, what data you need to gather, how you access the funds. When you're comparing it to some of the other public sectors where you've got local authorities that have got big council offices, you know, a lot of people that work in them, they've probably already got plans in place to improve those buildings. They've got consultants on board that have got a lot of information on energy usage, how that building operates. You've got hospitals where obviously exactly the same thing. Again, they're big estates, but they're being managed by third-party contractors potentially that work as facilities managers. It's in their interest to try and get those funds because obviously they're going to all benefit from that as well. They're primed and ready to go when these things come out. But as you said, you've got 22,000 schools that are then sat there kind of hoping they're going to get a little bit of the pie, and the reality is they're not going to. The impact comes from these big estates, so that the kind of grant applications tend to favour that, unfortunately.
Fair enough. I mean, if we accept that government has finite resources, of course, which it does, we're surely going to have to look at how we can, you know, leverage private market investment, and that it will also, at the moment at least, have to comply with the Academy's handbook in terms of schools' abilities to be able to access financial vehicles, etc. How do you feel about operating leases and power purchase agreements?
I think if they're vetted in the right way and they're set up in the right way, then there's no harm in schools going down that route. But I think there obviously needs to be an insurance back behind that to make sure that they're realising that the cost savings they're going to get at the end of the day, and they're going to pay for what they're going to be charged for electricity usage if they're looking at PPAs and things like that. So I think it's one route to go down. But you know, the finance thing's quite interesting that you've mentioned. I think that's the missing key piece for schools to be able to go on their journey. You know, they haven't got a infinite resource of money available to them. They're kind of scratching around trying to find funding opportunities or hoping that, you know, there's some extra funds that come out. But the reality is the funds aren't either at the level they need to be to actually have the impact they need to, or they're not going to get it. You know, they're not going to be successful with these applications they're looking at. So having the ability to go to some reputable, sustainable finance sort of bodies would obviously help them on that journey a little bit. And I think if there was a bit more thought from Department for Education and government to think about what that might look like and pre-vet people so they had the confidence that they were getting what they've been promised in terms of finance backing and investment into this decarbonisation of the school estate, then it's probably the way they should start to go, really.
I mean, there is definitely a perceived lack of genuine commitment from current government to make the requisite significant investment in both the school estate and the decarbonisation of it. And this undoubtedly has a detrimental impact on schools' own ability or willingness to invest and commit resources. Do you think that a change of government might change things this year? Well,
I think the promises say that. The pledges say, don't they? I mean, 2021, obviously, Rachel Reeves declared that they want to make the UK a clean energy superpower again, which is good. You know, being a big advocate for sustainability and kind of clean technology, that's what we want to see. And they're promising a 28 billion in green investment per year, which is an extra 20 billion on what we're already getting at the moment. So you would hope schools would get an element of that. But as always with these things, I'm never quite as confident when they actually get into power, these start to dilute a little bit and the promises become a little bit limp. and they don't quite get what they need to. But if they're going to achieve net zero by 2050, something's got to happen. And for the UK to be fully net zero in terms of power, fully decarbonised in terms of our power by 2030, that will have a knock-on effect. But the only way we're going to realise that is by all of our public sector buildings, not just schools, switching to electricity. There's no point in decarb in the grid if you're not using electric to do that. If you've still got fossil fuels out there that are heating our buildings, then we're stuck back with square one, aren't they? So they need to put the investment in improving the buildings, getting the fabric up to speed, starting to transition away from fossil fuels. And then I think it'll start to go towards the right place. But the pressure's building. They've got to at some point. They've got to do something.
It's very interesting sometimes when someone says to me, "Oh, we can't afford to." It's very instructive when you say, "Well, can you afford not to?"
Yes, the line.
If we don't, if we, as part of our options appraisal, if we decide to put gas back in, effectively that boiler will be in there until 2040, the final decade before hitting our target.
Yep.
So how much dare we paint ourselves into a corner by deferring these decisions? Surely at some stage they've got to grasp the nettle and make significant investment for us to be able to even contemplate reaching the 2030 or 2050 targets.
Exactly right. It's going to be someone's problem at some point, isn't it? It's just going to get further and further down the line until it's a mad rush to realise this. And my fear is that it's going to be too late when we do finally realise what we need to do. But what I would say is the momentum's there. There's a lot more talk going about it. Schools seem to really want to go on this journey. Kids really want to go on a journey. There's a massive pressure from children. We see it. I've got kids, and they want to do the right thing. They want to help save the planet. They want to kind of push their school forward in the direction it needs to go. So I think the pressure's going to build to a real point where it just has to happen. It's got to.
Which brings me on to the last sort of section, is kind of future optimism. Given this rather gloomy place that we find ourselves in, we began with the challenges, both the building of the infrastructure and the cost of the infrastructure in terms of D&O and planning, etc., plus inheriting the age and condition of various distribution boards, etc., and other infrastructure, and the, in theory, spark gap that needs to be covered. There's a lot of challenges ahead, and dare we be optimistic, James?
You've got to be optimistic. Yeah, no, I think we do have to be optimistic. It's a case of everyone collaborating and working collectively towards the same goal and listening to other people's experiences and where things have gone right and where things have gone wrong, and taking from those and making sure that plans that are being put in place in the future allow for those, to ensure that schools are always going to go on the right route. And that there might be slight discrepancies, but not to the point where it's made it a negative experience compared to what should be a positive experience for the school. I know the DfE are obviously working hard at the moment to try and get a bit of a roadmap in place for decarb in the school estates, but without the backing from the government there, it's never really going to kind of get the funds it needs to do that. But we've seen it in the private sector. We've seen some success stories in the public sector. We know from some of the schools that we're working on at the moment that it is possible. It can be done. So it's just a case of trying to find out what that is and what that magic kind of formula is, and making sure we're replicating it and making it applicable to everyone. Everyone should be able to access this. So I'm I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't optimistic. Then I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But I think it will go in the right direction. It's just a matter of when.
I mean, to paraphrase, the school estate was not built in a day.
No.
And again, there are options here. You mentioned the hybrid option. It doesn't have to be do nothing. It doesn't have to be like for like gas, and it doesn't have to be full decarbonisation. Surely there are short-term, relatively risk-free, I say relatively risk-free, certainly not as risky as the full decarb, but there are relatively risk-free options to at least start that transitory journey.
I think that's the process. It's taking that first step. Whether it's a school just taking a bit more responsibility for their energy usage and doing things that don't cost money, that's probably a good first step. Setting up an eco committee in your school, getting the kids on board with it, starting to be a bit more conscious of what you're using and where you're using it, when you're using it, is really important, and trying to go on the journey of those quick wins first potentially. So if you've got a boiler that's there that's relatively new, then that's okay to leave that for a bit.
Maybe concentrate on the fabric.
If you've got old aging windows that need to be replaced, then get some more efficient ones in there. Pay that little bit extra. You will get it back at some point. The fabric's going to be there for a long, long time. That investment's over a long period of time. So that's certainly something that needs to be looked at. The lighting and the controls are so important as well to get those all in check and working properly. So when you take the kind of the awkward step, the more difficult step that we're seeing of your heating, it's a much simpler process. You're going to realise, a much more positive outcome from doing that. So I think it's worth bearing in mind. And what I'd also say is that if you are replacing your heating system, it's worthwhile exploring what that decarbonisation option might look like. Because you might be surprised by, putting in a very small investment in some sort of low carbon heat to work with what you're going to already do, you can probably realise quite a nice positive impact from the back of it. So it's just being a bit more aware and a bit more forward thinking of how you can improve what you've got.
And I guess for most schools, there is always the option of on-site generation.
Correct. Yeah. Solar PV is a really good way to go, so long as it's been designed and thought out in the right way. It's definitely the right way to go. We've seen some stories of schools where it's been put in and they've not quite realised either they're getting some more money back from the grid, from generation that's going back into the grid, or it's not being used in the way it maybe should be used. So they're not storing it to be used in the evenings. They're not, accessing it on a sports hall that's there that the solar panels are on top of. It's just trying to be aware of that. But solar panels, without a doubt, are really.
I'm only thinking
roofs are massive.
In terms of offsetting some of those large capex costs. There is something that they potentially could do going forward to, as I say, to try and reduce that as the years go by. So I think hopefully we're going to end this podcast on an optimistic note by saying that, at some stage, government coordination in terms of the DNO is going to have to be improved. There clearly has to be, a much firmer line that it's yes, and this is a good reason to not provide planning permission. I also kind of think that maybe that we should again flip it on its head and say there has to be a really, really good reason to go like for like gas.
Yeah, I think so.
Why can we not start from that point, rather than having to make constantly the case for electric?
I think so. It should be that we've explored all other avenues. This is the only choice we've got. That's the only one we can go down. And let's be honest, how often is it going to get to that point where that is the only option? I think there's always other things that can be done to improve that system. And I also think, we went back to it earlier about understanding your current heating system. That system, typically, even if it's a gas boiler system, it's probably oversized. It's probably been designed for a school that isn't being used in the same way it is now. They need to address that element of it as well. It needs to be optimised and working at its peak performance.
I mean, I like the idea of optimisation. My only concern again is that these are upfront costs.
Correct.
That tend to be borne by a school, which, most of my clients just simply don't have that money. But if the utilitarian output is good for everyone, then again, the fact that there might be a funding stream to assist with that, and if, as you say, that is the gold standard of data upon which any lender could rely, it seems to me, why aren't we doing more optimisation?
I agree, completely agree. And I think it's either not nervousness, but I think it's the unknown. It's the kind of the engineers have always designed things in the way they design things, and there's kind of this old hat side of doing things, which I understand completely, because we wouldn't have these optimization systems, these digital twin systems, if people haven't put the data into it in the first place and understand how it should be used correctly anyway. But I think it's just the fear of the unknown. It won't work. It's one of these things, but actually we're seeing it is working and it is generating the results, and it's actually disproving some of the designs that have already been put in that were supposed to give savings back to the client, and they haven't done. We're then going in there with this type of tool, and it's then giving those savings back to the client, which then almost pays for the upfront costs of going through it in the first place. So it's worth exploring. It's definitely worth exploring.
For sure. Listen, James, thank you very much for your time today. Obviously, if any schools listening to this would like to contact myself or James, feel free to contact us directly, even just to run some ideas past us.
Absolutely. Always there. We're always here to listen and to share any wisdom that we've got. It's we're here to help everyone, really. It's what we're here for.
Thanks very much.
You're
Cheers.
welcome. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.